what is valuable, and, ultimately, who belongs.
Mm-hmm.
We're sifting through the sources you've provided, which cover historical policies of exclusion, the mechanisms of modern systemic surveillance, and, well, the emerging strategies of resistance.
Our mission is to provide you with the essential architecture of control, moving from the physical segregation tactics of, say, the mid-20th century.
Right up to the digital gatekeepers in the 21st.
Exactly. And the stakes, as outlined in the source material, are profound. It frames this entire discussion.
You know,
It is a tension explored by towering figures like William F. Buckley Jr., who was a huge critic of institutional decay, and of course Martin Luther King Jr., who demanded moral principle in governance.
and we're seeing that tension play out violently right now in our cities.
Well, what brings this whole abstract concept crashing down to reality is the recent tragic event in Minneapolis.
The fatal shooting of a 37-year-old woman by an ICE agent.
Yes, that single event just perfectly encapsulates the volatility of federal power operating within local jurisdictions and the profound stakes involved when governance moves from community protection to, well, to community terror.
The mayor of Minneapolis' reaction was just an absolute refusal of the status quo. The sources captured this just visceral response.
Mhm.
He demanded that ICE get the F out of the city.
And that wasn't just political rhetoric, you could tell?
No, not at all. It was a characterization of the federal presence as actively terrorizing long-term residents. He talked about the sorrow for the victim's family, but the institutional critique was so sharp. He said, now somebody is dead. That's on you, and it's also on you to leave.
And that demand sets up the dichotomy perfectly, because while the mayor was demanding justice, the police chief, Brian O'Hara, he immediately turned to lawfulness. He confirmed MPD officers found the victim with a gunshot wound to the head, and that the investigation was quickly turned over to the FBI and the state's Bureau of Criminal Apprehension.
And the message to the community from both of them was unified on one thing: a call for peace.
A call for peace, asking residents not to escalate, but to protest safely, to protest lawfully.
That razor's edge justice versus lawfulness, that is exactly what MLK was talking about, isn't it? He insisted the civil rights struggle must remain a tension between justice and injustice, not devolve into racial warfare.
Right. And to find a path forward, you have to hold those two concepts in tension. And to even find that path, you first have to understand the architecture that defines who has a voice and who gets silenced.
So to understand today's
To even find that path, you first have to understand the architecture that defines who has a voice and who gets silenced.
digital control, we have to go back.
We absolutely must start with its historical precedent. We need to look back at the origins of institutional exclusion, the Baltimore Plan, to see how that blueprint for displacement really paved the way for the systemic surveillance and information warfare we face today.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Let's start with that foundational model, the Baltimore Plan. What was the public-facing narrative and, how did it so successfully mask its true intention?
Well, the plan, which emerged in the 1950s, was framed as a civic and moral necessity. The narrative was just meticulously crafted. It originated from a young social worker who brought her, profound shock over these terrible housing conditions to the director of public welfare, the health commissioner, and crucially, a powerful newspaper editor.
So it wasn't a top-down directive. It was packaged as a grassroots moral awakening.
Precisely. And the stated objective was to eliminate endless blocks of houses scarred beyond belief, making the city unfit for human beings. Organized civic groups pushed for new housing ordinances that outlined minimum standards for health and decency.
So on paper, the sources paint this as a victory for public health.
That is the masterful execution of the contextual lie. The deeper reality, as revealed when you analyze its execution, is that the Baltimore Plan was the first model of gentrification in the USA. It wasn't about renewal. It was an architecture of engineered displacement.
Engineered displacement.
Yeah. Its specific underlying purpose was to curate the demographics of a city under the guise of benevolence.
That phrase, curate the demographics,
Mm-hmm.
it suggests a really precise, almost scientific approach to social engineering.
Oh, it was profoundly systemic. The analysis describes it as a cybernetic way to record, observe, and steer or manufacture events and communities to cause crisis for minorities.
A cybernetic way, so it's a system with feedback loops.
Exactly. The crisis was the sudden imposition of unattainable living standards and economic compliance.
Yeah.
The plan's goal was to upgrade neighborhoods on the back of the residents' labor to transform slums and blight into nice neighborhoods.
And once the value is raised.
But the system could then scapegoat and price them out, allowing wealthier, whiter residents to move in.
So the residents provide the labor and the critical mass to stabilize the neighborhood, only to have the economic fruit of that labor plucked away by institutional forces that price them out.
Precisely. And the mechanism for this systemic theft, this engineered displacement, was housed entirely within the legal system. And that brings us to the plan's central innovation.
Which was?
The creation of the nation's first specialized housing court.
The first one. Okay, so why was creating a new dedicated housing court so critical to making this whole plan work?
Because before this court, enforcing housing violations was practically impossible. You have to imagine a general court docket.
Right.
You've got murder, robbery, assault, and then you have a minor housing violation like a leaky rain spout or a broken window.
It's trivial in comparison.
Exactly. The judge dealing with these life and death felony cases would correctly see the housing violation as trivial and just postpone it indefinitely. That was the existing bottleneck that prevented mass displacement.
So the specialized court removed the bottleneck. It took what was a common cause of urban decay, unrepaired, substandard housing, and it weaponized.
Housing court became a dedicated, efficient instrument of coercion. Its singular purpose was the swift processing of these violations and the uncompromising enforcement of the new minimum standards.
But it wasn't just that the court existed, was it? It was how they used it.
No, it was the specific legal trap utilized within it, the coercive economics of the suspended fine.
Okay, so how did that legal trap work on, say, a poor landlord or an owner-occupant? Can you walk us through an example from the sources?
Certainly. Let's look at the example of a Mr. Gary, a landlord brought before the court repeatedly. The judge, using the new ordinance, would find him guilty of, say, 10 days of violations and impose a heavy fine, maybe $50 per day, totaling $500.
Which is a huge amount of money back then.
A crippling amount. Then came the twist. The judge would offer to suspend the fine entirely if Mr. Gary immediately put that $500 or more into mandatory repairs to bring the houses up to the city's new high standards.
So the state was essentially forcing a mandatory capital expenditure on people who were already struggling financially under the threat of an even bigger fine.
It was an immediate economic pressure cooker. For marginalized owners and poor tenants, that mandatory upgrade installing new plumbing, new electrical, new sanitation systems, it was an unbearable, immediate financial burden.
They had no good options.
They had three non-viable choices. Either pay the crippling $500 fine and face financial ruin, take on predatory long-term loans to cover the cost of repairs, or, if they were landlords, immediately raise the rents to cover the upgrade costs.
And all three of those paths lead to the exact same place.
Displacement.
The tenants get forced out, or the owner has to sell the property because they can't afford the maintenance. So the court appears it's just enforcing standards, but the outcome is legally engineered removal.
That is the core insight. The Baltimore Plan was a targeted legal and bureaucratic mechanism designed to enforce the vicious circle that civil rights leaders were highlighting. MLK noted that institutional segregation ensures a lack of education, restricts access to jobs, which restricts access to good housing. Regulatory mechanism that legally boxed in the ghettos by demanding an economic compliance they were structurally prevented from ever achieving.
It's chilling how the court system was used not merely to ensure sanitation, but to actively patrol the private lives of its citizens and to, as you said, curate the city's demographics. Okay, so if the historical architecture of control used physical coercion masked by this legal benevolence, then today's control is achieved through psychological coercion.
Specifically, the plunge into hyperreality.
That state where information is so distorted that everything is simultaneously true and false.
And this distortion is the ultimate institutional weapon because it allows power structures to operate with impunity. They know they can use the literal truth of a regulation to mask a contextual lie of oppression.
And we see this strategy reflected in the highest legal echelons, right?
Yeah.
In the recent Supreme Court oral arguments in Thompson v. United States.
Absolutely. This case revolved entirely around linguistic philosophy in the context of criminal law. The core question was, when a statute, specifically 18 U.S.C. Section 1014, prohibits false statements, what exactly does false mean?
Just the word itself.
Just the word itself. The whole semantic wrestling match centered on whether a statement needed to be literally false when you view it in isolation,
Right.
or if conveying an untrue message in context was enough to make it a crime.
Okay, so let's start with the defense's argument. This was presented by Mr. Haar, and it was really rooted in legal literalism, right? Objectivity.
Yes, Mr. Haar argued strenuously that falsity has to be objective. The subjective perception of the listener shouldn't matter. His key textual argument was that Congress knows how to define ambiguity. So, since other criminal statutes often use the phrase false or misleading, the fact that Section 1014 uses only false must mean Congress intended for an objective standard.
A standard where the statement taken on its own is just factually incorrect, like saying you repaid a loan when you didn't.
Exactly. He was arguing that if we allow falsity in context to be the standard, then every half-truth, every omission, every poorly worded answer becomes criminalizing confusion.
And the justices really tested that concept.
Oh, relentlessly. They asked hypotheticals. What if a person provides only the first of 3 pages of financial disclosure? That's literally true, but it's overwhelmingly misleading. Is it false?
And what did Hare say?
He maintained that if a statement is literally true, the government has to charge the defendant under a different, more context-specific statute that explicitly includes the word misleading.
But the government, represented by Mrs. Flynn, they championed the contextual standard, focusing on the message that was conveyed to the listener.
Right. Mrs. Flynn argued that you have to view the statement from the perspective of the listener and the purpose of the statute. She insisted that a statement is false if it conveys an untrue message to the recipient in context.
Even if the precise words used might be literally accurate under some hyper-literal reading.
Exactly. And the specific example from Thompson's case just illuminates this tension perfectly. He had received an invoice for $269,000, yet when FDIC agents asked him about his debt, he said he borrowed $110,000.
Which he had borrowed at one point.
He had. But the government argued that in that specific context, discussing a financial audit related to the bigger invoice, the statement conveyed the false message that the higher debt didn't exist.
I see. And the justices' questions during the argument really reveal how hard it is to draw a clear line here.
It's incredibly difficult. One justice asked, what if someone asked me how old I am, and I say 25, and I am 25, but they were actually asking me for my shoe size? Is the statement false? And Mrs. Flynn's argument was essentially yes, because the speaker had a contextual intent to deceive or knew the listener would derive a false conclusion.
That legal ambiguity where objective fact becomes subservient to contextual implication, that is the very definition of a weaponized hyperreality.
And it connects directly back to the Baltimore Plan.
How so?
The institution used the literal truth of the housing code violation, the existence of a rat, a leaky spout, to enforce the contextual lie that the whole process was civic improvement. The system penalized citizens based on the implication of their situation, that they're poor and therefore a blight, rather than addressing the structural injustice.
So the debate in Thompson just shows this institutional power to define and warp truth is alive and well, operating at the highest level of government.
It is.
Now we have to shift focus to the modern overseer systemic surveillance, which operates via these model, right? It involves both government and private corporations.
And it vastly expands the scope of control beyond physical courts and into our daily lives. This modern architecture has really traded the coercive legalism of the housing court for the coercive economics of information control.
And it's pervasive. It's often hidden in the mundane services we rely on every single day.
It monetizes our vulnerability while simultaneously policing our dissent. And what's unsettling is how deeply integrated the private sector is becoming into this surveillance state.
Right. Let's look at the data sharing between FedEx and Flock Safety.
This is a textbook example of a public-private surveillance partnership that just bypasses traditional transparency laws. Flock Safety is a multi-billion-dollar startup that makes AI-powered license plate recognition, or LPR, cameras.
And FedEx, a massive trusted delivery corporation, installs these cameras on its trucks and its facilities.
They do.
So what exactly are these cameras recording? Is it just the license plate?
Oh no, it's far beyond that. They capture exhaustive metadata, license plates, the make, model, and color of the vehicle, any visible damage like dents, and almost satirically even bumper stickers.
Bumper stickers.
Bumper stickers. This information is instantly geotagged and uploaded to Flock servers.
And that proprietary data is then shared with law enforcement. The Shelby County Sheriff's Office, for instance, they confirm they share reads from our Flock license plate readers with FedEx in the same manner we share the data with other law enforcement agencies.
So it's a reciprocal agreement.
It is. It creates a mass surveillance network that operates outside the checks and balances traditionally imposed on police departments.
Right, because when a private entity like FedEx, or incredibly Kaiser Permanente, a large health insurance provider, shares this Flock data, they are not subject to the same public disclosure or warrant requirements as the police.
Law enforcement gets privileged access to an enormous, rapidly expanding database of citizen movement history, all compiled without legislative oversight. It effectively transforms the civilian infrastructure of commerce delivery trucks into state surveillance tools.
Monitoring people preemptively just in case they commit a future crime.
Let's do a deep dive into another key institutional network involved in policing dissent. The U.S. Postal Services Program, ICOP.
The Internet Covert Operations Program.
Yeah. Why is the law enforcement arm of the Postal Service tracking American social media posts? It seems so far outside their mandate.
Well, the official pretext, as they stated, is protection. They claim ICOP ensures the safety of postal employees, infrastructure, and the prevention of misuse of the postal system.
But the activity revealed in the sources goes way beyond just protecting the mail, designed to monitor constitutionally protected activity.
It is. The program employs analysts to systematically scour social media platforms, looking for what they categorize as inflammatory posts related to planned protests.
And the sources specifically cited their tracking of events like the Worldwide Rally for Freedom.
Yes, which consisted of protests against lockdowns and the rollout of 5G technology.
Which are squarely within First Amendment protections. So how do they justify tracking protests that have absolutely nothing to do with mail delivery?
Well, this is where the justification problem becomes so apparent. The internal bulletins themselves contained a crucial disclaimer. Regarding these planned protests, they noted, no intelligence is available to suggest the legitimacy of these threats.
So they admit there's no real threat.
They were tracking dissent proactively, not reactively, to credible threats against the mail. Yet the data, screenshots, timestamps, and usernames is compiled, marked law enforcement sensitive, and routinely distributed to other government agencies via Department of Homeland Security fusion centers.
So even if the threats are baseless, the USPS generates intelligence value for the federal security apparatus.
It feels like they're manufacturing justification for their own budget and existence.
That is precisely the observation made by critics. Facing constant financial turmoil and intense criticism for service quality, the Postal Service may be engaging in this intelligence gathering as a kind of bureaucratic survival mechanism. By proving they can provide tangential intelligence on domestic dissent, they maintain relevance and potentially justify a larger budget for their law enforcement division.
Regardless of its relevance to postal infrastructure.
Exactly.
So we have this vast network, Flock Safety, ICOP, local police, all sharing data and defining who is potentially dangerous. How do these institutional networks shape individual privacy and professional success beyond just policing protest?
Well, they shape individual outcomes by acting as gatekeepers that monetize vulnerability and circumvent established legal protections. On the economic front, surveillance turns personal crises into profit opportunities.
Can you elaborate on that? The airline pricing model you mentioned earlier?
Certainly. Airlines like Delta have discussed leveraging AI and personalized data to implement dynamic pricing models. Now, they may not target a specific person named John Smith due to legal restrictions.
Right. But they target his device identifier. If John's browsing history, his location data, or associated text suggest he is searching for an emergency flight, maybe due to a family death or a medical emergency, the AI detects this personal crisis.
And this system just adjusts the price in real time.
Yes. The AI generates that third hand, as they call it, intervening in the transaction flow. It knows the user is in a non-negotiable situation and is therefore willing to pay, say, $350 for a ticket that might otherwise cost $200.
That's the financialization of human vulnerability, made possible entirely by pervasive institutional data collection.
And on the law enforcement side, the technology actively works to bypass the constitutional protections that are supposed to govern our due process.
Absolutely. We see this with tools like MSI catchers or stingrays.
These are sophisticated tools utilized by agencies like ICE. They essentially mimic legitimate cell phone towers, tricking all mobile devices in their vicinity into connecting to them.
And once you're connected,
The agency can track the device's location and, in some cases, intercept communication metadata.
since this just intercepts signals so broadly, it feels like a clear violation of the Fourth Amendment, which requires probable cause for specific searches.
That is the core issue. Because IMSI catchers are often deployed to track individuals for civil violations, like tracking an undocumented person rather than probable cause for a crime, their use often falls into this legal gray area that technology has just outpaced.
So the technology provides a massive shortcut for surveillance, circumventing the kind of judicial oversight that would normally restrict such broad monitoring.
It's a systemic technological bypass of due process in what we're calling the surveilled society.
So the same vast institutional networks that track us through our delivery trucks and police our social media, they also decide who succeeds and who fails professionally. How accurately can these networks really predict an artist's or a movement's future success?
Well, this brings us back to the power of the gatekeepers, but viewed through the lens of network science. In fields like contemporary art, there is no chronometer.
No objective standard.
No, there's no measurable standard like time or distance to define quality. Value is created entirely by the consensus of complex network or the Tate or dominant commercial galleries like Gagosian.
So the network dictates the canon and the rewards. Talent might be the prerequisite, but the network controls the trajectory.
Exactly. Talent is merely the entry ticket, but the connections sustain the career. And the predictive power of these networks is startling. It's captured in what sociologists call the prophecy of the first five.
The prophecy of the first five. That sounds incredibly deterministic, almost like predestination defined by your early contact.
It is deeply deterministic. Research shows that by analyzing the caliber of institutions that host an artist's first five exhibitions, you can predict their long-term trajectory, their commercial success, critical acclaim, placement in major collections 10 or 20 years into the future with extremely high accuracy.
So how does the network structure make this prophecy self-fulfilling?
It's the difference between starting at the center and starting at the periphery. If an artist's early work is embraced by the central nodes, a major museum, or a top-tier gallery, they gain immediate legitimacy, resources, and connections.
They're effectively tenured by the network.
They are, and their success is amplified through a mechanism known as the Matthew effect. Success breeds more success. Their path to the core of the market is just expedited.
And conversely, what happens if an artist starts on the periphery, in some small, unknown gallery?
They enter a vicious circle of exclusion. Starting in unknown or regional institutions makes it profoundly difficult to break into the center, even if their talent is exceptional. The network is fundamentally designed to amplify those already within it, and it tends to ignore talent that doesn't arrive pre-validated by a central node.
So the network isn't just reacting to merit, it's actively creating merit by determining who gets access and who gets seen.
Right. And if we connect this network logic back to the Baltimore plan, we can see how this architecture of control perpetuates exclusion, whether it's in housing or in high culture.
That is the crisis of the soul we are facing. What if these same powerful institutional networks, the art gallery, they were used to further the original Baltimore plan logic? What if the tactics and messages of art and culture were curated and distorted against the community that's struggling for justice?
That would result in the ultimate realization of hyperreality, where the suffering of the poor is rendered not just invisible, but perhaps even aesthetically pleasing to the oppressor.
The network validates the narrative that erasure is actually improvement.
Precisely. The housing court says blight is gone, that's the literal truth, but the community is erased, that's the contextual lie. The media and art networks then sanitize the suffering, making it palatable. This manufactured reality is the goal of institutional control.
We started this whole deep dive by invoking these pillars of American thought, William F. Buckley Jr. and Martin Luther King Jr., both insisting on the necessity of having a voice. So the question is, how do we all maintain a voice against such an encompassing, self-validating architecture?
If the center is compromised, if the gateway to legitimacy is fundamentally exclusionary, then the strategy has to shift entirely.
Okay.
The answer lies in the strategies of the creative minority and, crucially, in moral refusal. Dr. King's insistence that the struggle must be one of principle, a tension between justice and injustice, means we have to enlist consciences. The key is decentralized action, refusing to wait for validation from the central gatekeepers who operate the prophecy of the first five.
So how can we use art and anonymity to help spread a message of togetherness and rebellion, bypassing those controlling networks in a way that Dr. King would recognize as morally sound?
The strategy is direct. You don't seek the approval of the prestigious museums. You have to look to the sources on the 250 successful outsiders who defied the prophecy of the first five.
Okay, what do they do?
They didn't rely on one dominant gallery. They exhibited everywhere they were willing to show their work, creating many random acts of exhibitions.
The self-validating, decentralized system of cultural truth-telling.
It's a refusal to cooperate with systems designed to commodify and control. It leads toward a movement that seeks a world where many worlds fit, mirroring the Zapatista principle of radical communal autonomy.
And in the surveilled society we've been talking about, anonymity isn't about hiding. It's a necessary shield for this moral refusal and for political speech.
It's a tool of survival for the creative minority, protecting their political dissent from being cataloged and neutralized by the likes of ICOP and flock safety.
Exactly. When the institutional networks are designed to build a cohesive, weaponizable profile of every citizen, the primary goal of resistance has to be digital obfuscation, decoupling your biological self from your digital identity.
Right.
Let's get into the practical means of resistance, starting with decentralized communication, which can sidestep the entire infrastructure of the surveilled internet.
The most robust technical example cited is Meshtastic. This is a completely free, decentralized mesh network. It operates using LoRa, or long-range radio signals,
Which allows for low-power encrypted messaging.
to hop from node to node across distances that can extend for miles in good conditions.
So it requires no internet, no cell tower, no SIM card. It's entirely off-grid.
That's the power of it. The sources noted its immense utility during regional catastrophes, like Hurricane Helen, when conventional communication infrastructure failed. It allowed communities to organize aid and recovery on their own.
And the hardware cost is incredibly low.
As little as $10 to $40 for a node, often achieved by converting inexpensive devices like solar lawn lights or simple ESP32 modules, it renders the entire ICOP surveillance apparatus completely irrelevant to that communication.
That's a powerful example of using accessible technology to reclaim autonomy. Okay, so how do we use digital obfuscation to stop institutions from building a cohesive profile when we do have to use the traditional internet?
We have to prevent the aggregation of personally identifiable information, or PII. The first step is protecting your email identity, which is often the primary key used for cross-referencing all your activities.
So services like Simple Login or Proton.
Exactly. They allow you to create unique, disposable email aliases for every single site you visit.
Why is an alias superior to just having one burner email account?
Because if a retailer, let's say Lowe's Chicken, suffers a data breach, you have the alias you generated for them.
Right, like Lowe's Chicken at whatever.com.
And if that alias suddenly starts getting spam from a third party, you instantly know who sold your data, and you can switch that alias off forever without affecting your primary address at all.
That immediately reveals institutional bad actors. And I assume the same logic applies to financial transactions, where companies are desperate to sell your purchasing history.
Precisely. Use virtual credit cards like those from privacy.com. You link this service to your actual bank account, but when you make a purchase from an online vendor, Amazon for example, the vendor only sees a unique, tokenized card number issued by privacy.com.
So your real PII, physical address, and bank details remain shielded.
And these cards can be configured for single use or with low spending limits, which is key for security. They prevent malicious actors from exploiting your information if a vendor is breached, and they prevent institutions from tracing your aggregate spending habits back to a single, easily identified individual.
It's a systemic refusal to allow your consumption data to be weaponized.
It is.
And finally, we have counter-surveillance, actively mapping the physical grid of observation deployed by companies like Flock Safety.
Knowledge is the first line of defense. DIY tools, often built around inexpensive ESP32 microcontroller hardware like the Flock U project, are designed to detect and map nearby surveillance cameras, specifically Flock Safety LPRs.
How do they do that?
They achieve this by monitoring the digital signatures, the network broadcasts, and the device IDs that the cameras themselves emit.
This allows the community to literally map out where they're being watched, turning the passive experience of being monitored into an active, informed choice about movement and assembly.
It reverses the power dynamic. And all these resistance strategies, the mesh-tastic network, digital obfuscation, and counter-surveillance mapping, they're all components of a larger commitment to moral refusal.
The ultimate rebellion against hyperreality must be a refusal to accept reality drawn by authority.
It requires choosing moral principle over political expediency, regardless of the personal cost. You have to look at the fictional President Dillman's struggle over the extradition of Robert Wheeler.
Right.
When he was faced with a decision that would politically destroy him, refusing to extradite an accused assassin, who later turned out to be this deceitful dupe, Dillman said he was desperately trying to think of a reason to stop the extradition because principles mattered more than political survival.
He chose the moral right, and he endured the devastating political consequence, demonstrating the commitment required to reject a corrupt system.
That is the core commitment we must find. The Zapatistas in Mexico exemplify this radical refusal. They rejected the metrics of global capitalism and state governance entirely. They prioritized communal justice and refused all external aid, even if it meant economic hardship.
A refusal to be categorized, commodified, or controlled.
That refusal to be controlled by the institutional metrics of profit is the only way to successfully counter the hyperreality imposed by surveillance and exclusionary networks.
So what does this all mean? We have followed the architecture of control from the coercive legalism of the Baltimore Plan, where courts weaponize poverty to enforce racial and economic exclusion, to the modern, omnipresent surveillance of ICOP, stingrays, and flock safety. We've seen how both historical and modern networks act as ruthless gatekeepers, determining who has a voice, who succeeds via the prophecy of the first five, and whose suffering is erased by engineered cultural narratives.
I think the learner has to understand that the fight for privacy is fundamentally not about merely hiding. It is about safeguarding what makes you vulnerable, your personal identity, your political speech, your financial freedom, and maintaining absolute control over your own narrative.
And that institutional power to define truth, what we saw in the Supreme Court debate over whether a statement is false or merely misleading, that is the ultimate power.
It is. It's the power to create a functional hyper-reality where citizens are penalized and the resulting gap between fact and context.
We have to meet their architecture of engineered displacement with a design togetherness, leveraging inexpensive decentralized tools like mesh-tastic and digital obfuscation to reclaim our collective voice, refusing to be boxed in by their system of control and classification.
The Baltimore Plan succeeded by leveraging the labor and hope of the community against itself, forcing citizens to upscale their neighborhoods only to be priced out. So if today's networks of surveillance and predicted success, the prophecy of the first five, are similarly weaponized against the community to enforce compliance and achieve mass displacement, is the ultimate act of rebellion not just technological anonymity, but a radical moral commitment like the Zapatista principle to prioritize everything for everyone, nothing for ourselves, thereby making oneself invisible to the metrics of profit and control that drive the system, ensuring that your soul, at least, remains uncommodifiable.